want you to think about a time where you had to give a performance of some sort, whether you had to get up on stage, you had to get up in front of the class, you were playing in a really big game, you were sitting down to take a big test, right? I want you to think about the influence that your emotions, a component of which we learned is physiological arousal, but how do your emotions play into the way that you perform? Or in that case, how did your emotion play into the way that you perform? Well, we're learning right now that there is a relationship between that physiological arousal and our performance. We call this the Yerkes-Dodson law, or the inverted U function, which essentially says that there is an optimal level of arousal that is required for optimal performance. So if I'm very over aroused, so think I'm like very just emotionally overwhelmed, right? When I sit down to that big test, I'm in my own head. I've got a lot of negative self-talk going. I'm telling myself that I can't do it, right? What's going to happen? Well, look at performance over here. I'm going to see a decrease or I'm going to see an impaired performance as a result because of that anxiety. Also, though, on the other end, let's say I go into that big test or into that big game or whatever it is under aroused. Let's say I'm exhausted. I'm not focused. What's going to happen? Again, we're going to see an impaired performance because of not enough arousal. So if I want to perform my best, whether it's on the field or on the stage or sitting down to take a test, I have to have this optimal level of arousal in order to perform my best. So let's think about these examples. I want you to think, would this task require a high or a low level of arousal? Because the level of arousal that is optimal does vary depending upon the difficulty of the task. So how much arousal is optimal for each of these tasks? Think about taking a difficult physics test. Do you think our optimal level of arousal needed is on the higher or the lower end? How about sitting through a boring lecture? Do you need a higher or lower level of arousal? How about reaching a new level in your favorite video game? What do you think? High or low arousal? What we're going to learn is the more difficult the task, the lower the arousal that you want to have. The easier the task, the higher the optimal level of arousal you want to have. Or I should say, the easier a task, higher levels of arousal are optimal. The reason being is that for difficult or intellectually demanding tasks like the physics class or a chess match or something like that, if you were to take those already difficult concepts and add to it too much arousal, you're going to be overloaded. Whereas tasks that require you to persist and to endure, like sitting through that boring lecture, is going to require higher arousal just in order to maintain your attention and your focus so that you can get through it. So this shows us the Yerkes-Dodson law again, but just kind of more specifically related to the type of task that we're completing. So again, optimal anxiety level for an easier task is higher than for a difficult task. Difficult tasks, we don't need extra anxiety overwhelming us when we're already faced with something that's really challenging that we have to do. But again, on the other end of the spectrum, if we're doing something really easy, we want, I've said before, anxiety isn't necessarily bad. It pushes us forward. Without it, we would be very unmotivated, right? So we need it to an extent in order to help us endure and persist. If we think about this relative to sports, there was a famous tennis player, Arthur Ashe, who said there's a syndrome in sports called paralysis by analysis. So how do you combat the arousal is you learn how to manage your thinking. And this doesn't just apply to athletes. This applies to any of us in any of the situations that I've talked about so far in this video. Symptoms of arousal, physical symptoms of arousal, is that sympathetic nervous system response, right? It's the increased heart rate, rapid breathing, feeling jittery and sweating, feeling like you have to go to the bathroom all the time, the knot in the stomach, muscles tightened up. Cognitive symptoms are that negative self-talk, getting into your own head, imagining the worst case scenario or catastrophizing, worrying and doubting yourself. How do you manage this arousal? Again, not just for athletes, but for anyone. How do you get yourself at that optimal level of arousal? Well, you counteract the physical symptoms by deep breathing, maybe mindfulness exercises, practicing muscle relaxation. And one way to do this is to like tighten all the muscles in your body and then let them go like one muscle at a time, or like starting with your feet, working your way up, just like relaxing every part of your body, thinking of relaxing imagery and listening to music and just kind of managing the environment. So, for example, if you know that being on your phone right before a big game is going to make you worked up, then put the phone away a couple hours before. That's one way of managing the environment. Also, having a routine, and we can talk about this in class. Some of you might have routines you go through right before a big performance that help you manage these physical symptoms. Managing the cognitive symptoms involves positive self-talk. I always say, I shouldn't say I say this, but I love this quote. Talk to yourself as you would to someone who you love. Speak kindly to yourself. Talk yourself up. Be your own hype person, so to speak. Focus on, focus on what you have to do. Focus on the successes that you've had in the past. Try distracting yourself from the stress that you're experiencing. Have cue words that you say to yourself every time you get up and you have to sit down and, take that test. What are some positive mantras that you can repeat to yourself over and over and over again? These are ways to combat those mental symptoms. So again, the idea behind this is that we practice something we call cognitive restructuring. We try to conquer our negative emotions by changing the way that we think. All right, that's really what we're doing. That's really what we're doing here, right? Like we're trying to overcome this negative self-talk that's going to play a big role in helping us manage our arousal. So to overcome overthinking, one of the expressions is let the implicit override the explicit. So in other words, let your muscle memory go. Like that's the cerebellar memory, the implicit memory, right? The procedural memory. Let the procedural memory go and try to block out the overthinking that's happening in the cerebral cortex or in the conscious part of the brain. And again, part of this is, also sometimes acknowledging the negative self-talk that we have and restructuring our thoughts in a way that allow us to think more positively. So in other words, tracking the accuracy of a thought that we have. If my thought right before I take that test is I can never do anything right, I fail every test that I take. Just like, is that actually true? Is that accurate? Can I really never do anything right? Have I really failed everything I've ever tried to do in this particular class? So tracking the accuracy of the thought is helpful. Practicing, just noticing, and this is where mindfulness really comes in very handy, is mindfulness teaches you to be more aware of your thought patterns and to kind of stop yourself in the middle of a negative thought pattern, recognizing that we're prone to having these negative predictions about what might happen if, and just stopping ourselves when we're having that particular distortion.